Hello, everyone, and welcome to the new episode of You Can Exhale Now podcast. Today, I am hosting Michael Ceely, and we will talk about a topic that I don't think gets enough of attention in media, and that is men and men in therapy and men expressing their vulnerability and how the male part of our planet goes about dealing with their own mental health issues.
Welcome to You Can Exhale Now, a mindful living podcast for the modern pace, hosted by Ceely. This podcast is for anyone who wants to get more out of life without the burnout. Because when you learn to take proper care of yourself, you have more energy, a more positive outlook, and more gratitude for life. And because you cannot reach your goals if you're tired, overwhelmed, judgmental, angry, and feel sorry for yourself. Each episode, you will learn actionable strategies for self-care, mental health, productivity, better life-work balance, and happiness from coaches, therapists, and experts. Stop holding your breath. You can exhale now. Choose to be a more authentic version of yourself than you've been in a while.
Michael, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Your specialization in men's therapy and teaching men to show their vulnerable side. Can you speak a little bit about that and why do you think this is important?
Yeah, definitely. First of all, thank you, Leslie, for having me on your show. It's a lot of great topics here. You're right on. There's men in therapy, when you talk about vulnerability, which is quite a buzzword these days, I like to really define it, I would say, properly. And what I mean by that is I think men can be kind of threatened by that term in terms of when I see men in therapy. Sometimes they're maybe sent there by their significant other or some sort of problems cropped up, and it's hard for them to even just to get into therapy. First of all, there's a lot of kind of resistance to that. It can be seen as a weakness, as men feel sometimes they have to figure everything out themselves. And so I think vulnerability is actually a great word because at least what it can mean for a lot of men is exploring this area or this part of themselves that is allowed to seek help, is allowed to say, hey, I'm wrong, or is allowed to say, hey, I feel like I need some assistance right now. And when I work with men and say we talk about that word vulnerability, I sort of make a reference to sports where, and this resonates sometimes with men, is if you're on a team, say a sports team, and you're not, quote unquote, vulnerable to your other players or not working really well as a team or not able to lean on a team member, or, like a classic example would be, say in basketball, we have this term called a ball hog, someone who just thinks they're the best on the team. They don't need any help. I'm strong. I can handle this. And they end up actually losing the game for their team because they're not willing to be, what I would say, vulnerable and being able to rely on other people and being able to admit, hey, I'm not strong in this area. I need help. So I like to really talk about the word in an empowering way for men so that it kind of resonates with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, men are not taught to be vulnerable, right? For them, they see it as weakness. Do you see any change in that perspective, in the recent years, or do you see any kind of positive strides in how we educate boys to grow into, healthy, stable, strong, truly strong in mental health men?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of progress has been made just in terms of, let's say, maybe 20 years ago, the word vulnerable probably wouldn't even come up in conversation. So just really the dialogue about, say, that word about men being having a sensitive side, men actually having emotions, what a concept. There's a lot more dialogue about that. And I think that as the generations go by, I think men are going to be more in tune with that. Um, so it makes me think of, I don't know if you've heard of someone named Lewis Howe. He has a podcast out and
Mhm.
talks a lot about his story of kind of learning to be more vulnerable with himself and with others, being more sensitive. Um, and yeah, I think you're definitely right that it's men are evolving in that way in terms of being a little more balanced. Men typically, um, in terms of their what they feel that they're good at, what I mean in terms of like problem solving, like just I'm just generally speaking, and historically, men have felt like sort of leaders of the household. They need to have everything figured out, be this sort of pillar of strength, and not even show any kind of weakness or emotion. And I think things are more balancing these days in terms of men being able to admit that they need to have, vulnerability and being able to show emotions.
Absolutely. I think you touched on a very important point about kind of societal rules and societal roles we take on as, males and females. And definitely men has to be like stronger, like you said, pillar of the family. And I think that kind of that makes asking for help being perceived as weak, right? And asking maybe to go into therapy is asking for help. So why do you think men are struggling to do that? Is it more they're afraid to be judged, or is it something that sits much more deeply?
Um, well, definitely, I think anyone who goes to therapy, that's an issue that can come up about feeling judged. But in terms of uh, just men getting into therapy, again, like I mentioned, often they will be sort of pushed or referred by someone else, in say in their family, who's like kind of forcing them to go, which is actually a good thing. But it's harder for men, I think, to just proactively reach out. So I think there's a number of factors that go into that. Like I mentioned, this traditional sort of breadwinner, pillar of strength in the family, not even admitting to needing help. That's a big one. Um, I think other factors could be simply just men not having developed that part of them, which is able to really lean on people. See, if you think about so like traditionally, women have had more sort of social friendship groups and are able to be vulnerable, I think, more with each other than men. So that's like a traditional sort of societal sort of role, I would say. So for men, yeah, really again the barriers are just traditional family roles, what's perceived as a strength, peer group culture, and then also sort of messages from the mass media. Again, I think those sort of reflect and mirror society as a whole. And nowadays, you see a lot more sort of roles for men in terms of just non-traditional roles for men you might see projected in the media, and that's giving men, I think, more permission to to be more in touch with that emotional side of themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm interested in, I think one of the pillars of strong, good mental health is being able to be in tune with your emotions, right? To understand what you're feeling and why you're feeling it. And I think women are just a little bit more intuitive about those things. Maybe they were taught by their mothers or their girlfriends, or as they speak to girlfriends, they're able to get to the bottom of their emotions and just get it out there. But men are typically not like that. So do you have any strategies on how to develop that skill of being a little bit more self-aware, a little bit more in tune with your emotions, your feelings, and your needs?
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing for men, and well, really for anyone, is creating space for yourself to slow down out of your typical routine. We can really get on autopilot in terms of our just daily emotional habits. Let's say starting the day, working, coming home, and so specifically for men, if they can get into maybe sort of, I'll call it like an emotional rut where there's maybe something on the back burner or in the back of their mind that makes them sad or makes them angry or something that they haven't really dealt with. And they shove it kind of on the back burner, really don't deal with it, and can go day after day just sort of suppressing these sort of scary, frankly, emotions. And I would say a strategy for getting more in touch with that is obviously therapy, but also men can slow down and create space for themselves. And we call it in the industry here, in the psychotherapy industry, we call it self-care. So just being maybe setting some meditation time aside every day, going for a walk, something that's not always this sort of driven kind of problem solving, non intuitive type of style, but being more reflective, picking some flowers, doing something that's just really puts them more in touch with their emotions and out of sort of this daily grind. If that makes sense, just like creating something that makes you just happy, basically, during the day, and having that time to slow down can put you in touch with your emotions.
Yeah, and I think you've highlighted an important point that, I mean, people in general still think that self-care is just another buzzword, right?
Yeah.
I think for men especially, uh, I feel like they think of bubble baths and stuff like that. But I just want to highlight the importance of understanding what self-care truly is, right? It doesn't have to be bubble baths. It's whatever you enjoy. Could it be hobby, for example, some kind of hobby?
Yeah, certainly. Leslie, my background is in athletics. I used to be a professional bicycle racer, and I think for a lot of men, they can get that emotional bond or be in touch with that emotional side of themselves through sports. So when you talk about self-care and bubble baths, sports often for men, and just for people in general, can be a place to show more vulnerable emotions, and really kind of show that bond between other people and being willing to be vulnerable. So working with men, the number of men I work with are athletes, and some of their most important relationships are through sports. So be it, a hobby, how serious you want to be with that sport. It could be yoga, it could be bicycling, could be running. Men typically in those situations, in those social formats, are able to share some deeper emotions. You see athletes crying sometimes after males after they say win an event. Um, Teams, guys hugging each other after a sporting event. This is a sort of a permissible, I'll call it, at least area for men to show those kind of more vulnerable emotions. Um, and it's a good conduit for that to develop that. So yeah, you don't have to take a bubble bath and put cucumbers over your eyes. You can engage in some say some sports or athletic activities that'll bring you closer to people.
Yeah, and I think what you've described is very much somatic. And
Yeah.
I love somatic work, and I think it's really important. So, can we take it a step deeper and talk about the somatics behind all of that? So, not only does it feel good in the moment to play a game and win, or play with your friends and bond over the game. But what's the importance of this somatic work you're doing while you're exercising, playing sports, cycling, doing yoga, hiking, whatever it is you're into?
Yeah, well, you're definitely very right. The somatics tying into emotions, especially. Um, just simply getting moving. So let's say that if you're stressed out, if you're anxious, or if you're feeling opposite kind of lower energy, maybe more depressive symptoms, simply moving your body really starts to free things up. You can burn off cortisol if you're stressed out. If you're a little on the more depressive side, some physical activity really changes your brain chemistry, gets things going and moving. I'll share a personal experience, which I think touches on the somatic aspect you mentioned.
Yes, yeah.
Um, yeah, I discovered yoga probably about 20 years ago, and I'd never done it before. And I was a very serious athlete at the time, and I remember doing this just wonderful session of yoga. And at the end of this, or toward the end of the session, I became really sad. Almost, well, I wouldn't say almost. I started crying a little bit, and it was the first time I had experienced not the memories. Emotional memories are stored in the body. I think that maybe you've maybe heard that before, but this particular style of yoga really freed up. It was such a almost bizarre experience, but it just made me fall in love with yoga because I could have this venue for being in touch with some difficult emotions, and so the yoga kind of freed up some of those maybe more sad or more angry or difficult emotions. Um, so that was the first time I was really, convinced that there's this tie between the body and the mind and the spirit, and that freeing up certain areas can get you in touch with parts of yourself that way. So yeah, I thought I'd share that as the best way, I think, maybe to demonstrate the somatic part of what you're talking about there.
There is a kind of a belief or a notion, I don't know how rooted in science it is, but there's one belief that women typically live longer because they are allowed to show emotions throughout their life a little bit better, right? Society allows women to cry, to laugh, to be hysterical sometimes, and it's not the same for men. Do you think there's some truth to that, or is it just completely bogus?
Oh no, yeah, there's definitely truth to that. Well, there's some studies out there on how suppressing emotions, especially anger and sadness, can lead to, well, not lead to, but kind of affect heart health, physical heart health, so pulmonary health. As how much of a factor that is, I'm not really sure. Certainly a little bit. I think the main factor, perhaps, in women living a little longer is just being more social, having greater social networks. Men definitely have that as well. It's probably part biological too, but I think you really touched on something there. Just having, permission to express yourself in your friend group, and even in society at large, can be really healthy. Suppressing emotions leads to, for example, if you're stressed a lot, if you're suppressing anger, that raises cortisol levels and stress hormones, and over a long term, that can affect your immune system. That can do a lot of things to your body. So, yeah, I think you're right. Having expressing emotions, being able to do that is just healthy all the way around.
Mm-hmm. I think maybe another problem is, the way men perceive self-care is,
Yeah.
a lot of times they think of it as a passive activity, right? Like you said, um, like a bubble bath, for example. It's a
Right.
pretty passive way to spend your time. And I think typically, usually men are perceived as problem solvers, as
Yeah.
productivity type of mind that they have. So how can you help them move over this hurdle of perceiving self-care as this passive um, time spent versus being productive in those moments of self-care?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's hard for men, well, women too, in society, for a lot of us to give ourselves permission to take a break, to engage in self-care. Just as simple as getting enough sleep, simple as slowing down here and there. But specifically for men, giving them permission to say slow down is kind of a difficult sell sometimes when I do therapy with men. Um, Kind of a good way to sell it, I would say, is thinking about like the metaphor of say recharging a battery on your phone, where if you're running around all day, end of the day your battery's super low, um, you're just literally running out of energy. So the way I kind of sell it to men is you're going to be actually more productive the next couple of days if you take care of yourself and recharge your battery today. And that can make sense to men and sort of on an intellectual level, and then they can give themselves permission to engage in some self-care. And then once that habit is started, let's say that I'm working with a male client and he's very, very driven, figures things out all the time, as you say, gets to bed at 1 a.m., gets up at 5, it's just the engine's always going. The way to sell it would be, hey, you're going to be more productive, recharge your battery. And then let's say this male client realizes that after self-care is integrated into his daily routine, he just starts to feel happier, feel better, sort of explore this other side of himself that needs that type of love and self-care. And then, so I'm a big believer in assigning my therapy clients habits and little bits of homework to try before I can convince them, or before they can convince themselves, say that self-care is good. And then through doing that habit on a regular basis for a small amount of time, things open up, like you say, somatically, like, oh my gosh, this feels good. What an interesting thing. I'm allowed to feel good, instead of being driven all the time. So I guess to answer your question, habits, just establishing something before you convince yourself intellectually can lead to sort of that liberation.
And what about, we speak a lot about society today, but there's also that hyper machismo, right? There's that what's been coined as toxic masculinity, not only in the United States, right, or Western world society, but also other cultures around the world. And I think while Western world is moving a little bit closer towards accepting men as people, being
Yeah.
vulnerable, being sometimes weak, sometimes needing help. There are other cultures that are still very much about this and this toxic masculinity. And I think it affects negatively not only the men who are participating in these cultures, but also their women, right? Women in their culture, women in their family. So how can we, I guess, uncover that? How can we first of all see if our friend, family member, our loved ones, our special someone exhibits that toxic masculinity, and how can we help them step away from that a little bit?
Well, that's a tough one. Yeah, you're right. There's certainly, well, if we define toxic masculinity first, I think it's this notion of being very, I would call it defensive, about, say, vulnerability and difficult topics, sort of using anger as a shield in order not to deal with things. You see that, oh gosh, I don't want to pick on any particular sort of social group or sport or anything like that, but I mean, you can see it, definitely. You see it portrayed in the media, see it in certain behaviors. So toxic masculinity. Um, yeah, to actually maybe family members or friends of, say, a guy who's engaging in toxic masculinity. Maybe give an example to illustrate. Let's say that there's maybe a family gathering at a holiday or something like that, and then maybe a man in that particular family is engaging in, say, maybe racist or homophobic comments, or just really kind of sort of an anger-based commentary, say, with the family. Um, in order to maybe help this guy get a little bit more in touch with maybe some difficult emotions, I think a good start is maybe counterintuitive is empathy for why someone is acting that way. So if somebody makes a real insensitive comment, a guy is making this comment, being curious, and it's hard with family because you can get really sort of triggered by old patterns, but just having empathy for, gosh, it must be so hard for that person to not be in touch with some of their emotions, or to be kind of anger or fear based. Gosh, that really sounds really difficult. They must be suffering. No, not to excuse their behavior, which may be offensive to other people, but to just start from a place of empathy. Like, gosh, why, if I acted that way, what would be going on for me to say something really insensitive? That can be an opening up of maybe dialogue between, say, family members, to talk maybe more about someone's toxic behavior in that way. So empathy, I think, is the magic word here.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. Um, I think, another thing is, and I that might be stereotypical sounding, but like we've talked about, I think women are a little bit more intuitive. Women are a little bit more interested in self-care, right? Both physical
Yeah.
and mental self-care. How can they help their husbands, their dads, their sons to become a little bit more in touch with themselves, so to spend a little bit more time in self-care, and I guess just develop a little bit more of self-awareness? Because I think from what
Mhm.
I've seen, a lot of times when women start on this journey of self-improvement, right, self-care, um, they oftentimes lose a little bit of touch with their husbands or loved ones who are not as far along in the journey,
Yeah.
call it that way. So how can women help men without like pushing, but in a very loving, very
Mhm.
feminine way?
Okay. Yeah, I think a good way to, again, sell that, like I mentioned before, selling men to say self care, or something, some sort of activity that's going to put them, more in touch with themselves. I think just creating structure. So the self, or the maybe uh, the spouse of the man, or family member, would be, let's create some family time, or some couples time, creating an activity or structure that really cultivates the self-care. So typically that would be like a walk. When I'm working with men in therapy, I'll often sort of prescribe this homework of, wait, hey, why don't you try a 30-minute walk with your partner and just appreciate the beauty around you. And really, I think carving out activities in, say, the weekly structure can be helpful for men. And then once they establish that habit, they begin to maybe realize, like, gosh, I really like this. I don't want to maybe admit it, but it feels really good. So, in in order for us to, a family member to really get men involved in self-care, just carve out that time on a weekly basis, and even like a 30-minute walk, say once a week. Maybe not quite enough, but at least it's a start, and could be a real inroad to helping.
So just basically creating that habit for them.
Yeah. So suggesting something that's going to put the guy in a situation where he's going to just be enjoying himself with nothing necessarily to do or to figure out. And again, like I mentioned before, once you start a new habit, there's a study that came out of London a couple years ago. I forget the name of the study, but it was talking about how long it takes to establish a new habit. And it's typically 2 months. If you can do something for about 2 months, that becomes sort of a new baseline. So just creating an activity that's conducive to self-care, doing it for, say, 2 months, and that's when you really start realizing that you like it, that it's not as hard as it was before. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And do you think all habits and all self-care routines are created equal? The reason I'm asking is because a lot of my male friends tend to think of self-care as playing PlayStation for hours on end while drinking beer. While I can see the merit in it once in a while, but I'm just wondering whether there's really a difference between like a really good self-care routine versus I guess just developing habits that are easy. Maybe you do turn your brain off, maybe you veg out for a few hours, but I guess are all routines created equal?
Well, I would say no, and that's just my own sort of bias. But no, I've worked with male clients who've had sort of I'll call it video game issues, and their spouse sort of sent them to therapy for that. But yeah, I'll speak from a place of just sort of my opinion and bias. I think an activity that's very, maybe overly stimulating, say drinking a lot of alcohol or playing a video game, or maybe doing kind of a more, I guess just sort of stimulating activity that puts you kind of in that place of using angry emotions or very driven kind of behaviors, is not a good form of self-care. So, but at the same time, I know men who say have this video game habit, and it is a real release for them, and it's not, they don't overdo it, but it could be a nice way to kind of to unwind. So I guess there's a difference between just simply unwinding and kind of blowing off steam, or going out drinking with the guys, that kind of thing. The difference between that sort of relaxing, releasing activity, and cultivating a self-care activity that puts you in a different zone, especially for men, that idea of slowing down, of being more sort of quiet and sensitive. Big fan of yoga. That's a good one. Meditation is a difficult sell for men, but can be really, people can really learn to enjoy it. Taking walks, things like that. So yeah, I would say no, not all self-care activities are created equal in terms of, say, cultivating, vulnerability and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting, that men are trying to stay productive even when they try to relax, and again, society kind of dictates this, that men have to be career oriented, money oriented, to support their families, to be a good husband, quote unquote, by providing the financial support. How do you, I guess, try to relax those notions for them, and how maybe women can help their men to see that their productivity or their financial success in life doesn't determine their worth, the man's worth.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think men, women too, can say if they're in that provider role, can get lulled into this sort of I'll call it a spell of just productivity, just being in that zone, that high intensity zone all the time. Difficult to get out of it. But again, I think establishing a new habit or carving out that routine, once somebody tries it, is a good way to convince them. So I think it's a bit of a leap of faith of getting someone to say, sort of confronting them in a gentle way, like, hey, honey, you've been working, 50, 60, 70 hours. I'd really like us to do something. Oh, I don't have time. The real inroad on that is getting an agreement going of just trying an activity that's going to get them to slow down. That's really the first step. I think convincing someone intellectually can be really difficult, but putting it in terms of trying a new activity, sort of like a test or something like that, can be a good inroad there. But yeah, again, I call it like a spell of just being on this treadmill, thinking that you got to keep being productive. So yeah, the sell would be get them to agree to do just something that's going to be conducive to slowing down.
Mm-hmm. And I guess my last question is, there is still a lot of stigma, like we've talked about in the beginning of the episode, is that there's still a lot of stigma around men's mental health and men going into therapy and men asking for help. So how do we as a society, both males and females, can help just go in the right direction, nudge the society in the right direction, that at the end of the day, we're all people and we all have our struggles, our needs, our wants, and how do we help, I guess, everyone get to that next level?
I think just more dialogue about it like this. Your podcast is great for it. Also, you've heard of there's some people, sort of more high profile male athletes, who are starting to speak out about the importance of men and mental health. One person that comes to mind is an NBA player, Kevin Love, who, God, if you haven't heard his story, it's really inspiring. Kevin Love, he was a couple of years ago, was really suffering from panic attacks and was suppressing it, not seeking any kind of help for it before it got out of control. And he just completely has been transparent about his mental health issues and normalized it and saying, hey, we all have mental health issues. So I'm a big fan of athletes who've come out recently about mental health issues. Also, Steve Young, who's an American football player, San Francisco 49ers, wrote this book called, I'm not necessarily endorsing it, but he wrote a book, I think it's called Beyond the Spiral, where he talks about all kinds of mental health challenges throughout his football career. There's a number of people, I think Michael Phelps come out talking about some mental health issues as well. Just really the way to do it, I think, is just more conversations like this conversation. And people having the courage to just say, just go public with admitting to things that have been difficult for them. Like earlier in our conversation, I talked about my yoga experience, and I was almost not going to say, because I caught that part of me that's like, oh, I don't want to admit that. That's going to make me look weak. But being able to just speak out and kind of normalize conversations like this, then people kind of relax and they go, oh yeah, it's not that big of a deal that I've been so stressed out that I haven't been able to leave the house for a couple of days, or whatever the thing might be. Once it's normalized and sort of aired out, then it gives everyone permission to kind of relax. So yeah, to answer your question, it's just more conversations in more public places about men and mental health.
Yeah, and I hope that this episode will become one of those little building blocks to getting rid of stigma, and hopefully another person, independently of their gender, will go and seek the help they need.
Yes, indeed. I hope that's the case.
Michael, thank you so much for coming onto the show today. I thought it was a great conversation and a great topic. I hope that men listen to this episode and women listen to this episode to help their men to improve their quality of life, right? Because self-care always improves the quality of life. So thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge today with us.
Lesia, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for listening today. I hope you've learned a lot of new strategies. Be sure to check out the notes below this episode for additional resources and tools mentioned in today's show. I would love to keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts and takeaways with me on social media channels wherever you are. And do not forget to tag me. I'm so grateful for each and every one of you, and I will see you on the next episode. If this podcast has helped you even a little bit, please leave a review and subscribe so that we can help spread the message together.